Welcome. I'm so excited to have you join us today. My name is Linda Williams. I am a community outreach and training manager with Consumer Action. And on behalf of the entire staff at CA, I would like to welcome you to share your financial data with care webinar. I am so excited about the conversation we get to have today about being security savvy. We have three great speakers joining us today who will share their experience and years of expertise with us. So get ready to be amazed. Today's training is going to be a little bit of shock and a little bit of awe. That's right, shock and awe. So buckle up and get ready for the ride. Now, before I get too excited, I need to go over a few housekeeping items. As the announcer stated, when you join the webinar, you are in listen only mode. But you can use the question function on the right of your screen to type in your questions. At the end of all three presentations, my colleague Nelson Santiago will facilitate a question and answer segment. This is where we want to hear from you. So please take a few seconds, find that question function so that you can send Nelson a ton of questions, especially since we have three subject matter experts with us today. You don't want to leave. You don't want them to sign off without answering your questions. If you're on Twitter, you can use that platform to ask your questions. Our organization handle is at Consumer Action and CA Webinars. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available to you tomorrow afternoon or sooner, along with the PowerPoint slides that's used for today's presentation. At the end of the training, you will receive a survey about today's webinar. We value your feedback as we work diligently to improve our service to you. So if you have a comment, a suggestion, or a compliment, we would love to hear from you. So please complete the survey. And as an extra bonus, you will receive a certificate of completion for attending today's webinar. Now, before we go any further, I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, TCH, for the opportunity to bring to you today's free webinar. This webinar is presented as part of Consumer Action's Share Financial Data with Care educational project, funded totally by the Clearinghouse. And on behalf of the entire staff at CA, I would like to thank the Clearinghouse for the opportunity to reach so many consumers in different parts of the United States today. TCH, we appreciate your support. As it says there on the screen under Welcome to Consumer Action, through education and advocacy, we fight for strong consumer rights and policies for all consumers, but especially underrepresented consumers nationwide. How? At CA, we advance consumer rights nationwide through our hotline by publishing educational materials on those pocketbook issues in multiple languages, reaching the consumers where they are by advocating for consumers in the media before lawmakers through networking, coalition building, media outreach, and of course, community outreach. Now, let me tell you about our latest creation. We've created some fact sheets on share financial data with care. So when you're on our website, in the search engine search bar, just type FinTech privacy. And then you will land on our project page. This is where you will find all the newly created materials related to sharing your financial data with care. For an example, if you click on the words fact sheet, you will find two of the fact sheets we just recently created. They are displayed on the right of your screen. If you click on news and resources, you will find a very useful fact sheet that discusses myth versus fact about financial data sharing. Now, you can use all three of those fact sheets to create an entire training for your clients. Click on webinar and video to enjoy two extremely informative videos created by Consumer Action on how to share your data with care. The videos are short, they're relevant and straight to the point, and should prove to be useful tools to help you teach your clients how to become security savvy. So let me just go over the agenda with you quickly so you know where we're headed today. At Consumer Action, we believe in making learning fun. So we open up each and every training by testing your knowledge on the topic of the training with our most popular game, How Much Do You Know? We teamed up with TCH today to bring you 4 true and false questions. So I'm anxious to see your response to the questions. Following the game, I will introduce you to the guest speakers. A question and answer session led by Nelson Santiago will follow. I will come back to tell you how you can donate to CA and wrap up. So let's start with the first game. Let's launch the first poll question. Are you ready? Okay, here we go. No other party has access to bank account information accessed by an app you use. Is that true or is that false? No other party has access to bank accounts information accessed by an app you use. Is that true or is that false? A couple more seconds. Okay, let's close the poll. Let's see the results. 16% of you think that's true. 84% of you think it's false. Well, it is totally false. And you will hear more about this from our guest speakers today. So if this is an issue of concern to you, please listen carefully to our guest speakers. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but most apps use a third-party service that collect and store your financial information. Okay, so let's go to the second question. The app only accesses the financial data needed from your bank account to enable the service to work. Is that true or is that false? The app only accesses the financial data needed from your bank account to enable it to work. Is that true or false? Come on, a couple more seconds. Okay, let's close the poll. Let's see the results. 13% of you thinks it's true. 87% thinks it's false. 87%? Well, again, it's totally false. Once in your bank account, a third party service can look at all of the information in your account, all ALL. Now, if this is an issue that concerns you, listen very carefully to the presentations today. What did I say? Shock and awe. Okay, let's move on to the third question. Okay, so once you delete an app, your information is no longer accessed or stored. Is that true or false? Once you delete the app, everything poof is gone right away. Is that true or is that false? A couple more seconds. Okay, let's close the poll. Wow, you guys are really security savvy. 3% thinks it's true, 97% is saying that it's false. Actually, spoiler alert for those who said it's true, this is another one that's totally false. And if you're listening to this webinar and if you don't know how to revoke and have access to your data, listen carefully to the presentations today. Let's go to the last poll question. You can use your bank's dashboard to manage an app's access, discover what data it's collecting, and revoke the app's access. Is that true or is that false? Oh, interesting. Couple more seconds. Okay, let's close the poll. Wow, over half, 52% thinks that's true. 48% think that's false. Well, that's actually true. You will hear more about dashboard management from one of our guest speakers today. And you can find the answer to the questions used in the poll and more in Consumer Actions Fact Sheet on privacy and security when using financial apps. So now, without further ado, let me introduce you to our guest speakers. Our first guest speaker is Ben Isaacson. Ben is the Senior Vice President of Product Strategy at the Clearinghouse. Ben is going to share with us TCH's consumer research on awareness and the uses of financial apps and much, much more. But first, let me tell you a little bit about him. He joined the team at the Clearinghouse in October 2018 to lead the firm's connected banking efforts. Ben has over 20 years of experience in banking and payment, most recently at Cross River Bank, where he was the senior vice president and general manager of the payment division and member of the firm's management team. Prior to Cross River, Ben spent 6 years at JP Morgan Chase, most recently as product executive within the Treasury Service Department. He was responsible for real-time payment services. He also led the wholesale payment strategy team at JP Morgan Chase and was responsible for long-term growth initiatives such as business-to-business payment strategy and FinTech engagement. He has an MBA from New York University, and he lives in New York with his wife and two kids. Welcome to the webinar, Ben. Our next guest speaker is Linda Jung. Linda Jung is a senior policy counsel at Americans for Financial Reform Education Fund. Now, Ben will identify some of the financial intruders, or I like to call them financial peeping toms. Linda will tell us how we can better protect our privacy when using FinTech products. So let me tell you a little bit about her. As stated, Linda Jung is the Senior Policy Counsel at Americans for Financial Reform Education Fund, which is a national coalition that was formed in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. Linda leads that agency policy work on consumer and housing issues. She advocates before Congress and federal agencies in collaboration with coalition partners from consumer advocacy, civil rights, legal services, labor, and other public interest organizations on an array of consumer protection matters. Before joining Americans for Financial Reform, she was the senior staff attorney in the Foreclosure Prevention Project at Mobilization for Justice in New York City, where she represented homeowners in all stages of foreclosure proceedings, including administrative complaints, pleadings, settlement conference negotiations, motion practice, discovery, and affirmative litigation in state and federal court. She graduated cum laude from Washington University School of Law in St. Louis, and she received her BA from Northwestern University. Welcome to the webinar, Linda. Our main objective today is for you to leave this training security savvy, on guard, able to share your financial data with care. Becoming familiar and using the tools and services offered by banks is one way that you can protect your financial data. Our last speaker for the day is Erin Ross. She is a digital project manager at PNC Bank, and she will roll out a tool created by PNC that's helping its customers have a good experience with their financial apps. Let me introduce Erin Ross to you. Erin is a digital product management professional who is extremely passionate about APIs and customer financial education. She's been with PNC Bank for 5 years, having worked with FinTech for the last 4. Her work focuses on moving PNC customers to a more secure way of using the financial apps that they love. She is a member of the Financial Data Exchange, a group working to create industry standards around data sharing and customer consent. Erin is based out of Philadelphia, and she likes to spend her free time exploring new restaurants. Now, that tells me that she is someone that loves and enjoys good food. So the next time I'm in Pittsburgh, I will be bugging Erin for the list of those restaurants. Now that I've introduced you to this dynamic team of speakers, let me get out of the way and turn this presentation over to our first speaker. Ben, please tell us about TCH's consumer research on financial apps.
Great, thanks, and hello everyone. My name is Ben Isaacson from the Clearinghouse, and today we're going to speak about your favorite financial apps and what happens to your data when you use them. So first, if on the next slide, let's briefly describe how apps work. So when consumers sign up for a financial app, it usually prompts them to enter their bank username and password. The app does this because if they can get your information directly from your bank account, they can quickly and easily make the app work for you. So consumers enter the username and password, and behind the scenes, the app works with a technology company called a data aggregator. And that technology company, they take your username and password and they program it into a bot. And that bot goes right into your bank account. It signs in as you. And once inside your account, it has full access to all the data. And they use that access to get whatever data they need or want. And once they have this information, they give it to the app, and the app now works for you, and everyone is happy. And this process is great for consumers because the app works very quickly and easily, but it brings a few things that are concerning. So first, these data aggregators, they power thousands of apps. And in order to make sure they're getting current data, they enter your bank account about twice a day. So much so that the clearinghouse's owner banks, they tell us that data aggregators make up almost half the traffic on their website. Second, we did significant consumer research that showed us that when consumers are consenting to this, it's often uninformed, where consumers don't really understand what companies are accessing their data, what data they're sharing, and what the companies are allowed to do with it once they get it. And thirdly, these practices can enable fraud. Data aggregation has turned into such a big business that one data aggregator, Plaid, has claimed that they store all the bank account information for 25% of all the consumers in the entire country. And these data aggregators are much less regulated than the banks that they're getting this data from. So this brings significant risk if there's a data breach at any of these companies. So overall, when we look at this model, we're really thinking about, the risk to consumers and what we can do as an industry to make it better. So if you go on to the next page, what you'll see is we've done research over the years on this topic, and we refreshed the research to really learn how much consumers understood about how these apps work and the risks they were taking and how to protect themselves. And one key learning we found was how prevalent app usage has become, where over 50% of consumers who responded to our survey have said they've used a financial app in the last year. And over the next few pages, we'll talk about some of the other key learnings we have. So, the first key learning that you can see here is that overall consumers feel very secure about their financial apps, but they don't really understand how the data sharing works. So you can see some of the key stats here that 70% feel confident that their data is private and secure. But what was really interesting is that 79% of consumers said they don't read the terms and conditions. And this is important because the terms and conditions are where all the information about how data is being shared, who's allowed to get access to it, what they're allowed to do with it, what liability they have if anything goes wrong. It's all contained in those terms and conditions, which, again, most people don't read. And one of the key ways we know that is, we talked about data aggregators on the previous slide, but 80% of consumers were unaware that a third party, even gets access to their data. So where they thought they were giving the data only to the app, they had no idea that they were giving it to a data aggregator who stores all their bank account information and can give it to thousands of apps. So some of the other, key learnings that we found from the research is, consumers were not aware of what kind of data the apps or the data aggregators were getting. So when they think about their app, they think, oh, this data aggregator or this app only needs a few pieces of my bank account information to make everything work. But what it turned out and what we learned in our research is that consumers didn't have, high awareness that a lot of sensitive data was being shared. So, for example, as you can see here, 80% of consumers didn't know that their bank account username and password was being stored by outside parties, largely unaware that their bank account number was being shared, that credit and debit card numbers were being shared, that even their home address and their date of birth were being shared. So consumers. So when it came to sensitive data, consumers really didn't know that this was being shared. So this was very important. And then now, as we go to the next slide, the other key piece that we saw is consumers didn't really understand how their data was being used. So this comes back to the point we made earlier around not reading the terms and conditions where this information is shared. So when you look at this slide, there's two pieces of information here. So the yellow bar is how aware consumers are of what's going on, and then the second, the green boxes show their discomfort with what's going on. So you can see some key things here that we want to talk about a little bit deeper. So first of all, that data aggregators of the apps assume either no responsibility or very limited responsibility if there's any kind of security breach that compromises your data. Secondly, that they're allowed to sell your data to third parties like marketing firms or research firms. Third, that they actually can retain and store your information indefinitely, so forever, even if you delete the app. So a lot of consumers thought that, hey, if I delete the app, it all goes away. And that's just not true. They can continue to access your bank account or store your data even when the app is deleted. And then there were some other pieces that not every app does this, but some apps do. For example, in the terms and conditions, they can have the power of attorney to actually initiate transactions or make changes within your bank account. So that was one. And then finally, when we talked about this with data aggregators, that they're using a third party to access your financial information. So these were all areas that consumers were largely unaware of, but really uncomfortable with. So, and then if you go to the next slide, what we wanted to find out from consumers is, well, now that you know all this, what do you want to do about it? And I think there were kind of two important learnings here. First of all, many consumers really like their financial apps, and people largely weren't saying get rid of the apps, oh, those apps shouldn't even be allowed to be in business. What consumers were saying is, I want to learn. I need to be better educated about this so that I can make my own decisions and protect myself when it comes to my financial data. So some of the key things they really wanted to learn about were things like how long apps can access your personal data, how long and how they store your data, how the data can be used, and who's actually gets access to the data and how it can be shared. So those were four kind of key buckets of information that consumers told us they wanted to learn more about. And then the next piece is we asked them, well, who do you want to learn from? Who should be sharing this information with you? And what we heard was it was really an all of the above kind of answer, where they thought the banks should be educating them, the FinTech apps themselves, industry and consumer groups like Consumer Action, and government institutions as well. So when we saw this research, these results, that was one of the key reasons why we're here today, is to help better educate consumers on this, not so that we're telling them to go delete all their apps, but helping them be aware of some of the risks that they're taking and also what they can do about it to better protect themselves. So on this next slide, let's talk a little bit about what the industry is doing about it, because that's really important. So first and foremost, the clearinghouse is working with our owner banks, and our owner banks are 26 of the largest banks in the country, as well as other industry stakeholders to help transition from this screen scraping model to direct connections between financial institutions and data aggregators um, through a technology called an application programmable interface, or an API. And what this does is it allows you to share your financial data without exposing your bank account usernames and passwords. So that was really important to everybody is, hey, if we do nothing else, we need to make sure that the only people who have bank account usernames and passwords are the consumer and their bank. So that was first and foremost. And we're doing that in a couple of ways. First of all, in 2018, banks, FinTechs, data aggregators, really everyone in the industry got together to create a standards body called Financial Data Exchange. And what this does is this helps make sure that all these APIs that need to be built are built in the same way. And if they're built in the same way, they're easier for everybody to implement. And that's really important because the easier it is to implement, the more institutions can build these, and the less bank account usernames and passwords will be shared in the market. So that's first of all. Second of all, the clearinghouse and 11 of our owner banks and Fidelity Investments, we launched a company called Akoya. And what that allows you to do is make one connection. So one API connection into Akoya will allow you to share data or receive data from anyone else who's connected to Akoya. And the key goal around that is also to make all this happen faster. Because one of the things that is, with slowing everything down is in the US right now, there are about 10,000 banks, and there are thousands of FinTech apps. So if thousands of banks have to connect to thousands of FinTech apps individually, that's going to take a really long time. But if everyone can connect into one place and get access to everyone else who's connected, you can do it a lot faster. So Akoya is a company that we launched to help do that, and we're making some good success there. The third piece about this, and we touched upon this very briefly at the beginning, was the fact that a lot of these data aggregators are not regulated to the same extent as banks are. And one of the requirements that banks have is that anyone they do business with has to go through very thorough due diligence. And this is an absolute regulatory requirement required by the government, and for very good reason, right? Banks are controlling your money, and they want to make sure that anyone who has access or the ability to get access to your money or make decisions over your money or your data have gone through thorough risk review to make sure that they're storing your data in the right way, have all the right processes in place to protect consumers and protect their data. So we worked with two risk management companies called TrueSight and KY3P to launch a risk assessment service to make it easier for banks to conduct this due diligence. So what they can do is, the way it works right now is, or previously, is that every bank had to do a thorough risk review of every data aggregator or every FinTech. And what we've done is, what these companies, TrueSight and KY3P, have done is they will do a thorough review of the data aggregator or the FinTech and provide that information to any bank who's doing business with them. And that way, every bank has all the data they need to make that risk decision and meet their government obligations to do the due diligence of any party they're sharing financial information with. So again, the real goal of that is to make all this happen faster. Because if thousands of banks have to do a detailed risk management process on thousands of data aggregators, it's going to take a very long time. So the goal of all of these things are to move to this environment away from screen scraping and towards API connections in, as quickly and safely a way as possible. So those are a number of things we're doing. A couple of other things that are happening in the industry is that, we're making good progress here. So some of the things that we just talked about are getting implemented, where banks and data aggregators are signing these API-based agreements. And once they have those agreements and they implement them, these APIs are in place and consumers won't have to share their username and password anymore. And obviously this is really important and really critical. The other thing that banks are doing is once these agreements are in place and these API connections are in place, banks have a lot more ability to inform consumers around what data is being shared and with who. Because now with these agreements in place, the banks will actually know. So what many banks are doing, and later on in this webinar, we'll have a demonstration and an example of this, is they're creating management portals that allow consumers to see which companies and which apps are getting access to their data. So if you have an app if you go to the portal and you can see that an app is accessing your data and you haven't used that app in a long time, you can shut it off. And that's really important. Or if you see that an app that you like is accessing data that you aren't comfortable sharing, you can either stop them from seeing that piece of data or shut them off as well. So this gives consumers more control over how their data is being shared and who it's being shared with. And again, this is another really important improvement in the industry and something that we're going to see more about later on in the webinar. So that's my presentation, and that's hopefully you've learned a little bit more around how data is being shared and what you can do to better protect yourself. And at this point, I'll turn it back to Linda. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, for that informative presentation. Now that we know how FinTech apps are using our financial data, let me turn the webinar over to Linda so she can tell us how we can protect our financial data when using financial apps.
As Linda introduced, my name is also Linda Junn from Americans for Financial Reform Education Fund. And we've been looking at these issues from a consumer protection lens as part of our work. I just wanted to build on what we've been talking about. So one thing to keep in mind, just rewinding back a little bit in history, there's so much talk about technology and data these days that it feels like, this was never an issue, which, I think a lot of the problems are new, but like just reminding folks, if you think about an old-fashioned financial transaction before all this technology, there was always some data you needed to share, right? If you got a loan, they were going to check your credit, and there was things even before computers, right? They were checking probably, your whatever, if you banked with your bank, maybe your account information or that sort of thing. The old school, if you will, layaway programs, right? If you were going to make installment payments on a stove or a refrigerator before everything was taken over by technology, there was still, the store would still need your name and your address and your contact information and your payment details, and you would have to, pay them by check or pay them by cash. Same with brick and mortar loans, right? As we were talking about, it's true that there was less data, but there was always some data being exchanged. I think what's changed right now in today's technological world is the possibility with technology to have ongoing data collection and account integration. So it's not, if someone checks your credit once, and it was all on paper, they would check it and then they wouldn't be able to get more information easily from you, right? But here in today's world, if you give access to your bank account or access to your credit report, that's an ongoing thing that institutions and creditors can pull to evaluate you, but also it's once you give permission, they can, there's often a very easy way to continue collecting that information. And the early parts of this were online banking, so it's just you and your bank, and there's you and your bank both have ways to see all your transactions, your bank statements online, all those types of conveniences. But that does increase data, right? There's also the increased use of credit and debit cards. I know a lot of people rely on cards for almost all transactions, and that also means that that's all data that is available now based on what you use your card with. That's different from when people mostly just use cash. Online bill pay. Now, I mean, in addition to making it easier, I know it makes it easier for me to track my bills and pay them, but that's also that's also another source of data. And then, as Ben was getting into as part of his presentation, there's also just the increase of all the payment apps, the Venmos, the PayPals. There's also the budget and planning apps, the Mint, anything with retirement, right? There's those, and so there's an increased use of all of those tools, which means that there's both more data points, more ways to have data being continually collected, and more connection and integration between accounts. So that's the context we find ourselves in today, and where I think a lot of the concerns that we're discussing today also come together. So before we go on to the risks, I mean, I think it's also important, right? I think the title of this webinar is Share Your Data with Care, and the reason is it's not saying never share your data, and because I think it is important to recognize, right, that there are some benefits to today's world versus the old world I just discussed, right, where you had to write down your name and address and information on a piece of paper or form. I mean, there's the sheer convenience of it. It's a lot easier, right, for me to deposit a check without having to go into my bank and just deposit it online with mobile deposit. There's I can check my bank account activity online without having to go in at business hours. There's the speed element of it. It's a lot faster, right, to not have to rely on the mail. There's ways to streamline all the information in one place and organize it in a way that paper doesn't allow. I think one of the best parts of the data that I'm sharing that I've seen and the availability is fraud prevention. I'm always amazed with the credit cards and bank accounts when they can check like something, this doesn't look like you, and I know that saved me a couple times when so like that sort of fraud prevention, the speed and accuracy of that has really helped a lot of people. There's also a safety element, right, with when you use cards and you're able to do things online that you don't have to work, like as far as like actually dropping a piece of paper with private information on it, or a card, if it's stolen, you can cancel that pretty quickly. That's different and like less dangerous than carrying a bunch of cash around. Accessibility, right, as I mentioned before, you don't have to wait for certain business hours or certain you can do have all your accounts in a place, and you can handle all of that without, especially during COVID, right? You don't have to go in. There's the data sharing through and technology make it possible to have things much more accessible, and also the accuracy. I think the technology, there's a lot of human error that we can avoid through the ways the systems are integrated, and all of that. I feel like I'm sort of talking about technology and data at the same time, but just because they're inextricably intertwined. So just acknowledging that there are benefits, and that really the purpose of today's conversation is really how do we as consumers get the most out of these things, but while also protecting ourselves as much as possible. And that brings us to the risks. I think the number one risk is the data security piece. One of the things Ben was talking about when you give your bank account credentials to these apps is the fact that most people have used at least one app and sometimes more, right? And the more apps that have access to your bank account, right, that's spreading more risk around, right, each time, as much as they try to be secure. So data security is a huge risk. Identity theft relatedly, because of the way everything is intertwined, if your identity is stolen, that can set off a much broader ripple effect than it used to in the past. The challenges in recovering losses is, I think, one of the biggest problems with sharing data. One of Ben's last slides was saying that the FinTechs and others are not regulated in the same way often, and so that raises a series of concerns. There's also a lot of cloudiness on who's responsible in the event of a data breach, or if someone gets your information. Is it and that means it's not as straightforward who you go to if someone has, if there's been a problem, and that's a major concern. There's also, in a similar vein, a ripple effect of errors that may be hard to challenge or correct. So is it the app that got your information wrong? Is there something wrong in your bank account? Is there something wrong in your credit report that needs to be fixed? And how do you get that fixed, you know, when those things are intertwined? That can be a huge headache and also have much broader implications if it's not corrected. This is what Ben was getting at before. There's ongoing data collection beyond the initial purpose of why you shared your data in the first place. And often people just don't know what information is being collected and for how long, especially if you thought you were giving it for one transaction or for one purpose, even if it's an ongoing purpose, like budgeting or that sort of thing. So that's a major concern. I think there's a lot of problems right now with those apps, in that it's not intuitive and it's not really clearly explained how to stop storing or sharing information. So if you want to stop, or if you don't want them to do things anymore, first of all, it's as Ben was getting at earlier, it's a lot of people don't know to what extent and for what reasons what information is being shared. And also, just if you do and you want to stop it, the process is often hard to figure out. And so it's, when most people press accept, I think it's true that a lot of us don't, the terms and conditions, if you're going to use a service anyway, it's hard to parse through that. Those terms and conditions are, famously not in a very comprehensible format. More often than not, they're hard to understand, and so it's often unclear, what you've given permission for, and how long it lasts, and what information you've given permission for. So those are all the risks that I think we're collectively worried about here. That being said, there's a set of steps, we can try to protect ourselves as much as possible. Reminding folks what data sharing we're referring to, it's giving explicit permission to a company to access your data to use their services. So that, again, could be a budgeting app, it could be a retirement app, it could be peer-to-peer payments. I know apps do a lot of other things. So that's what's happening. And as Ben mentioned in his presentation, that's who's getting access to your data. It's not just the service provider, but there's a data aggregator behind the scenes who's actually facilitating the data sharing piece and collecting the information. And that's the Plaid and the Finicities of the world. And often, I don't know how familiar people are with data aggregators, as like they're not the known entities, right? It's people know Mint, and people know in tax services, people know Robinhood. I don't know how familiar the data aggregator names are out there, but there are a few, and you can do research on them. And it might take a little bit of digging, because that's not the first thing that the company who's offering you the services wants you to think about. But really, the first thing I think is to do the research, both with the company that's offering you whichever service, the app or whatever you're trying to use, and the service, to make sure that that's all above board. But also, do a little digging and see what data aggregator they use, or if there's policies on that. And one way to do that is to look at the company's reviews. There's often, I often do a search on the CFPB complaint database to see what kind of complaints have been, if there's any complaints against the company, and why. And of course, the complaints themselves, right? There's often narratives attached to them, so you can read through them and judge whether this is someone who was confused, or these are lots of legitimate problems that this company is causing, and maybe I should pause before I proceed. Sometimes there's other relevant state resources like that as well. So do your research. I think there's a lot of I know Consumer Reports has done a lot of research that they've made public on data security policies, but it's really so take a look at Consumer Reports information as well. It's really the things that are super convenient. I've always been taken aback by those the data security and data policy sharing policies not being what I would want them to be. And so there's always, if something seems really great as a service, it's really important to look, if you will, look under the hood and see how they are handling your information. One big thing is to make sure that you can find the contact information for the company and a way to get in touch if you face problems. There's a lot of apps that only have a generic info number, but make sure that there's a way to get in touch with them, because it's one of those things where you always hope that things go well, but it's when things go wrong that you need to be able to get in touch with them, and that's the thing you should look for up front, and see what you can find out about what data they collect and how it's being used, and especially how often they access your data. Like if it's your bank account, how often are they in there? How long do they keep your information? And then, of course, see if you can figure out what you have to do when you want to stop sharing your data with them and how to delete any data you have with them. I say all of this as things that we should all be considering with full acknowledgement that it is not easy to navigate. And I think there's another set of things to say about pushing to make this easier on with the CFPB, with government and with companies themselves, and putting pressure to make this easier. But in the meantime, these are things that you should keep in mind. And the CFPB blog I've linked in this presentation, it's a good place to have that goes into more details on these suggestions. So then, how to protect your data is a matter of course. You already have your apps, you have your online bank account, they're connected. And a lot of this is basic tech security, but it really does apply here. And so, one thing is check your accounts frequently. It's as a legal aid attorney, I used to speak to clients who just didn't check. Either they weren't as comfortable with computers, or they just like they let their retirement account just sit there, like it's just doing its thing, which is fine. But it's really important to check all your accounts frequently for any weird activity, to see if there's anything unusual going on, because that's the number one safeguard, is just checking in every few days. Make sure you have safe passwords. That goes, for your bank account and for any apps you use, any passwords you have there, if that applies. Multi-factor authentication. Make sure you're putting the protections on the front end to make sure that people can't get access to your account. Again, research the company, the product and service, any third parties that might get your data through before you give your permission whenever possible. See if you can figure out how to turn off permissions on apps and services you're no longer using. That's also something that in this electronic age, it's like, oh, well, I don't use that anymore, but I didn't close my account, or I didn't shut down my login. That often means that data is continually being collected on you. So that's, look into how to turn that off if you're not using them anymore. Monitor your credit periodically. Again, this is it's another really important thing to make sure that there's nothing weird going on there. And if there is, whether that's an error or an actual breach of some kind, that it's really important that you take action as soon as possible. And again, make sure you know how to contact the company, and what steps to take if there is an error, if there's unauthorized activity, or if there's any other problem. And so there's really the the identity theft scam. Someone has information, got into your stuff and is using it in a way that is not authorized. But there's also just errors, right? And I think one of the things with technology is that errors get replicated very quickly because of the way everything is intertwined. And so it's really important that you know what to do if that happens. And this is sort of an obvious point, but one that's important to say more again and again, which is try to figure this out at the front end, and not when you have not when there's issues, because when there's an issue, right, people tend to panic, and that's an understandable response. So it's much better if you're able to figure all of this out when that's not the situation. Sorry, I'm having a little okay. So unfortunately, there might be a time where there is a problem. I hope this for every one of us, that there isn't a problem, but just the world we live in with technology, it's possible. So the first thing is report anything suspicious immediately to your financial institution. A lot of these apps do connect to your bank account, and so your financial institution is the first line of talk to them immediately, so that they can take any safeguards to protect any further problems. Contact the company that's providing you that, if it's the app or any other service or product, if it's not your bank or financial institution. Disconnect any apps or services just to be safe. Change your bank account password. One of the ways most of these apps do connect is through your bank account password. So if you change it, and that's one way to disconnect the service as well. Data breaches are a thing in today's society. If you are notified of a data breach, take action as directed as soon as possible. Time is of the essence there, just to take steps to protect yourself. If you notice a mistake, take steps to correct that right away, whether that's something wrong on your credit report. There's often errors with accounts or with mixing files or that sort of thing. Make sure you keep on top of that and taking steps as needed. If there is a problem with some sort of account unauthorized credit that's been taken out in your name, identity theft, that sort of thing, there is a way to freeze your credit pretty easily. So make sure you get that done to prevent any further damage while you sort out the rest of the issues. And if the reality is often this is convoluted and the app might tell you to contact your bank and there's the credit, if you say there's something wrong in your credit report and the credit report tells you to contact who's the reporter, who's also known as the furnisher, there may be some going back and forth and might not be sufficiently clear. Hopefully you're able to, with persistence, sort it out. But if that's not working and you need to escalate to the next level, I would suggest consider filing a complaint either with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and depending on where you are, your Attorney General's office may also have a consumer complaint you can file, and any other financial regulators where everyone is. I know everyone is calling in from different places. But make the phone calls, file the complaints, do what you need to do. And I think the overall tip is pause anything from going further, right? Freeze your credit, lock your bank, talk to your financial institution about making sure that there's no further activity allowed on your account, and then take steps immediately to try to sort it out. And the last thing I was just going to end with is these are some safeguards that I think consumers need and some principles to keep in mind for the audience to keep in mind, and for those of us who are working on policy issues and at companies and at advocacy organizations, and those of us in our conversations with those who make policies around these, just to keep in mind. I call it kind of like, I think, the principles on how things should be so we can all take advantage of the benefits and avoid the harm. So data minimization is probably the first of those, which is, I really think that only the information necessary for the service should be collected and for that period of time. And I think that that's a conversation that a lot of folks are having these days. There should definitely be stronger rules on deleting information after a certain time. I think there's certain information that probably just shouldn't be allowed to be collected because of their sensitivity or the way that they're tied to, certain communities of color, or can otherwise be used in a discriminatory manner. Like one terrible example is, using. I know that there's been some research on, for example, graduates of historically Black colleges and universities, having worse terms than graduates of other colleges. So that sort of thing, like, we should look very carefully into those types of associations. There's healthcare data that's really sensitive. I don't know if that should really be allowed. And these are questions. So there's not clear answers on them in the law necessarily, as much as things that we as a society, I think, should continually question and think through. There's the transparency point. I think I really do think it should be easier for all of us. I mean, I am an advocate. I've done a lot of litigation in my life as a lawyer, and I still find it very confusing. So I think that's something we really do need to make it easier. And I think I know that a lot of financial institutions, especially, are doing a lot of work towards that that you'll hear about later. But really, consumers should know, what data is being used, how it's being used, and for what purpose. And it really should be in plain English, right? It should be understandable. It's, the terms and conditions that we have right now are hard to understand. To provide, some true consumer choice and meaningful consent to what you're agreeing to. There should really be some time limited and self-expiring data storage. I really don't think that people should have to do things to, like, have, if you're not using an app or a service anymore, where it expires and the data is no longer available. There should be some standard language across the industry, so it makes it easier for all of us. So those are some of the principles that I think our office, with other colleagues in our coalition, are use as our guidelines, if you will, for the types of things that we're pushing for in our advocacy, and things that I think. I mean, you've heard a lot about this, and I think you'll continue to hear about this from other speakers, what they're doing in their own work, that kind of line up with this. It's to make it more understandable and to make it easier for consumers to protect themselves. So thank you for being here. So that those are some of the things that we're working on, and I'm happy to turn it back over to Linda.
Thank you, Linda, for that great presentation. What did I tell you? Shock and awe. Shock and awe. Okay, Erin, I want to turn it over to you.
Okay. All right, so I'll spend a little bit of time on this slide as well. So at least at PNC, when we think about the data sharing ecosystem and the direction that we want to move in, we have a couple of goals in mind. We want to be able to remove customers' online banking credentials from the ecosystem. So your user ID, your password that these aggregators and fintechs might have. We want to allow PNC customers to be able to use the financial apps that they enjoy with the minimum data required to power those applications. So for example, if you're using a personal financial management tool, that application doesn't need your full account number. They don't need your name or address. So being able to minimize some of that data shared while still allowing you to use the full experience of the app. And finally, we want to help customers understand the actual data that they are sharing. So when we talk about kind of the differences between screen scraping and API data sharing, the way that you can think about screen scraping is that an aggregator or a fintech would ask the customers to provide their online banking credentials to that aggregator so that they can then log into your online banking account with those credentials that they've collected from the consumer. And then they collect as much data as is available in the online banking experience. So they can, access statements, or they can access, information around account number, credit card number, whatever they can find in online banking. It's pretty challenging to restrict from the customer end what data is being shared. And it can be tricky to easily stop sharing that information with the aggregator or fintech. As we saw in the quiz, it is, when you delete the app, it doesn't delete the data sharing. So you have to really take steps as a consumer and work to call into the aggregator or the fintech to stop that data sharing. Moving towards the API data sharing model, it's more consumer-based. So in that model, the aggregators actually have to ask the customer for permission to access the data through that API. Once the aggregator has that customer consent, the aggregator will get that data from an API itself. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there's a limited set of data that is provided. It doesn't include all of the data that's available in online banking. It's kind of a finite set of data that we've agreed upon. And then you're actually able as a customer to limit the accounts shared with the aggregator. So you don't have to provide all data. You can limit to maybe 1 or 2 accounts. So if you're doing or using an app that requires a deposit account, you don't have to also share your credit card account. You can select just that one. And then finally, with the API data sharing model, you're pretty easily able to some of those permissions or edit them. Okay. So going into what this experience actually looks like, we'll provide an example between, PNC and Intuit. So Intuit owns mint.com. They also, power applications like QuickBooks Online. They power TurboTax. They power Mint. With this, basically, you can see where the customer is today. One of the tips that I'll provide here is that when you are actually on the site, you can see the URL of mint.intuit.com. So that's where you kind of realize where you are in that process. So let's say I want to share my PNC bank accounts to Mint. I would begin by logging in, clicking their kind of add accounts button, and then I would key in, PNC on the screen that we see here. The next step of that process, Mint actually says, here's where you go. You go over to PNC's site, and that's where you would go to connect your accounts. So you can see that message here, and then I would click continue. So on this screen, you can see the PNC URL. So that is how you know that you are on the PNC site. So you should be able to see, the user experience here of being able to authenticate, being able to log in. So once I'm on this page, I would enter my user ID and password. And then I would be taken to kind of a second step of authentication. So just making sure from our perspective that, you are who you say you are. We would send you an OTP. You'd be able to generate a code, kind of enter that in from your text messages, and then continue on to the account selection screen. So once you verify your identity, our mission with this page was really to provide information in a way that isn't overwhelming. So we define the data that's shared as account details and transaction information, and then let the customer see what kind of information that includes. So for account details, that includes current balance or interest rate, does not include the full account number or credit card number. For the transaction information, this includes the amount, the type of a payment, and the date. So we wanted to make sure this is information that you could kind of dig into and learn a little bit more about. Similarly, we have an option to learn more, which really goes, a little bit deeper on the mechanisms of data sharing, or OAuth. And so it also lists some of the more widely recognized fields, such as credit limit, APY, or the interest earned. So it gives you a longer list of some of the data that's provided and gives a little bit more background. And again, this is for kind of the customers who are really interested in learning more about the process and, trying to understand the mechanisms of it. So let's say I choose to authorize all accounts. I am then taken to this page where I learn that I can manage, my access in PNC's Control Hub. I would then, click Return to Intuit. And then once I return to Intuit, I can see that my accounts have been successfully linked, and PNC sends me a message that my accounts have been linked as a confirmation step. So this is just to make sure that customers are aware, that they are alerted, and then you would be able to use the Mint application. Okay, so let's say a couple of months go by and I don't use Mint anymore, or I don't use it in the way that I initially thought I would. That is where I would be able to go into the Control Hub to update some of my permissions. So as you can see here, when I log into the mobile app, into the Control Hub, there is an Apps with Access section. When I click on that section, I can see the accounts that I have previously authorized. So I'm able to view the permissions. I'm able to view when Intuit last accessed my data. And I'm able to see what I have linked here. So let's say I don't really want the first account to be linked to Mint anymore. What I can do is deselect that account and then save the changes. That way, those two other accounts can still be shared with Intuit, but this first one cannot. So once I hit confirm, I can see that those two accounts are remaining and the first one is no longer connected. That is a way to update that permission. So Intuit is still collecting that data from the API for those bottom two accounts, but the first one, they no longer are able to access. So let's say a little while later, maybe another few months go by, I realize I'm not really interested in using Mint anymore. What I can do is come to this section, and then I can remove all of the accounts, hit confirm, and then you can see, none of the apps are linked to your PNC accounts. So at this point, that basically means that Intuit is no longer able to collect that data for the accounts that you had previously shared, and they no longer have that access. So that OAuth consent and API data sharing process, PNC is looking to move kind of all integrations with aggregators and fintechs towards. We have this established with Intuit, and we're looking to move really everyone away from that screen scraping process onto this more secure process. So that's all I really had. Linda, I'll pass it back to you.
Great, Erin. Thank you. More and more banks are creating tools like this, so be sure to check with your bank to see what they have to offer. Ben, Linda, and Erin, thank you for your presentations. Audience, please join me in sending the love to our guest speakers. Very, very informative presentations. Now it's time to hear from you, our audience. So, Nelson, do we have any questions out there for our guest speakers?
Yes, we do. And you can hear me okay?
I can hear you fine.
Well, great. And please go ahead and submit questions now if you have questions. But let's get started with what's come in so far. We have someone out of Florida here. How safe is it to use an online financial website? The attendee is saying, my investor has a program on the web that combines all our financial investments and bank data. Is this again a third-party operated program? Can we withdraw and not have our data still in their storage program? Linda or Erin, any thoughts?
So I think this goes back to some of the slides that Linda was sharing about some of the pros and cons of utilizing different financial apps. I mean, the pros are that it's convenient. It's a way to view kind of all of your apps in one location. But, some of the cons are that if they're using screen scraping, they have access to that information that we discussed or what you have in your online banking. So I think it's really kind of a personal choice if that's something that you're comfortable with. But we encourage you to take a look at, again, if there are CFPB complaints about the application, reading the terms and conditions, just to make sure that you really understand, what it is you're sharing and what these companies are asking for.
Yeah, I think Erin really hit that. I think the other thing I'll add is if it's through your investment company, I mean, usually they're not the ones who are making it getting all the data in the one place. It probably is the data aggregator in the background. And so just to answer, like, it's hard with data sharing because there's like the investment company may be the one that's saying that they're offering the service, which is true, but how they make that happen is this company in the background. And so that is something that you should, as Erin just said, look into. And it's hard. Like, it is convenient, and yet there are those risks. And unfortunately, not very many places have the API. I think it's growing, and I'm hoping, I think, Erin, I don't know if you know more, I'm hoping that it would continue as a society to move away from screen scraping. PNC is obviously out of that in a good way, but until then, I think that is a real risk that is out there and one for folks to balance.
Great, thank you. Somebody's asking here, how do you know who the data aggregator is in order to question them on all the aspects of protecting your data?
Sure. Some data aggregators or some fintechs, I think, are moving towards disclosing aggregators a little bit more. So you might see, if you use, for example, Cash App or Venmo, they may disclose their aggregator in the bank linking process. So I think fintechs are starting to become a little bit more transparent about some of these processes. And then, with PNC, at least when you go through that Intuit account linking process, we want to bring Intuit to the forefront to make sure folks know that they are involved in this process. So I think it's really trying to pay attention to seeing when you connect to that account, you might see a powered by, aggregator name. It's just not necessarily something folks pay a lot of attention to, but it's definitely something that is included in some of those screens.
Excellent. Another attendee is asking, how do we tell whether a specific app does screen scraping or API data sharing? And if you could tell us what API stands for, I don't know if you already did.
No, that's a great question. So API stands for Application Programming Interface. So that is basically just a way for companies to form easy partnerships with each other. But one way to be able to tell if an app has an API integration or they have, a screen scraping integration is, generally the rule of thumb is if you, at least for PNC, if you see that you are taken to a screen with a PNC URL in it and asked to authenticate with PNC, that is an indicator that it is an kind of API OAuth consent experience. If you are asked to provide credentials, within the app's experience, then it's a good chance that it is a screen scraping experience.
Thank you. Someone's asking, just, if I've taken steps to freeze my credit, do I have to worry about all these risks that you're talking about as much? How much do I need to worry?
I mean, I think that's hard because on one hand, like no one's going to be taking out credit in your name if your credit is frozen. So there is a significant set of protections there. That being said, I think there's different data. And it's one of those things where like if the biggest concern is someone as far as security and identity theft, you're in a much better place, because if anyone did get access to your information, they won't be able to use it. That being said, there's a lot of information that's collected. And I think there could be different things where you don't want that information out there. And I'm sorry, I'm struggling to think of a good example, but there are, there's analytics, there's all sorts of things, and some people are okay with that, and some people are not, that sort of thing. So I'll just say, like, there is information because there's often information that's being collected beyond just whatever for the intended purpose. That's something to keep in mind. But it is true that if your credit is frozen, some of the really harmful things that come from data breaches or from identity theft, you're probably in a much better place, since you'll get an alert if someone tries to take credit out.
Okay, excellent. Somebody's asking, what about legislation? Can we get legislation that requires the option to opt out, or that requires opt out, or that requires payment to the user every time their data is used? Anything coming down the pipes there?
Senator Brown actually does have a data privacy bill that's very expensive. So that's something that is out there. I think there are other congressional offices that are looking. I think there's a lot of interest in FinTech. There's an entire task force in the House Financial Services Committee that's been formed to look at the issue. There's a lot of elected leaders who are looking into this issue from all sides. And I think the other thing that always strikes me in these conversations, like today with Clearinghouse and PNC, is there's a lot of, I think there's more agreement than not as far as, as far as agreement that there should be, consumers should have some protections and some controls over the data used. And so, obviously there's differing opinions across the board as far as how best to do that. But I think it's a hot topic in DC, and I think rightfully so, in our current world. So I think there's also state legislation. There's the California law that passed, I forget California people are going to remind me, it was a couple years ago now. So there's a lot of things in the works, I think, both at the state and federal level, and I expect to see more interest and more hearings on it in the next few years.
Thank you, Linda. How safe are apps from the banks, like your Chase app, your U.S. Bank? Should you stick with the bank apps? How safe are those?
So I think, just speaking for PNC, we do believe that our apps are secure. When you have your banking credentials and they are only shared with PNC, we have our user ID and password protections. We have our multi-factor authentication protections, and we're, consistently evolving and, making sure that we're staying up on security trends. So I would say, using your financial app, your financial institution app, is a secure way to access your bank information.
Yeah, and I think there's also just like the fewer factors component, right? I mean, there's the steps in PNC, Erin has discussed at length that what protections they've specifically taken for their customers, but also, and I think there's other banks who might be taking similar measures, but also a data aggregator is a third party. If the app is from your bank directly and that's who there's a way to get in touch with your bank. There's a way to talk to them. It's directly a part of their service as with your account, whatever accounts you have with them, which means that there are less the more people who have access, the greater potential for problems, right? And not saying that there's always a problem. I think I will confess, as I say all this, as I said, the convenience is a real balance. I use some of these apps too, but that being said, to the question, this specific question, I think when it's directly through your financial institution, there are less hands involved in your data, and that's also something to keep in mind.
Great, thank you. And then for this question, maybe you don't have an exact answer, but what kinds of things do you have to think about based on what we learned today? The attendee says, Intuit also provides TurboTax reporting to the IRS. Is that a good reason to be linked to Mint? Is that when I want an app like this? And what do I have to think about in terms of our discussion?
I mean, I think it's a really personal decision. Yeah, Erin, I don't know if you have more, if you want to go first, but I was just saying I think it's like, I mean, I know a lot of people do use TurboTax, and that's a useful tool for tax filing. I think it's doing your research into it, and also just reflecting on what's important to you, as well as checking out, because also companies have different products and services, right? And like if there's do some research on how people's experiences with that specific product you're looking into, even from a different company. So I think I would start there, and then there's some personal questions to ask. I mean, as I said, there are risks and benefits to balance, and I too, as I speak before you, I use some of these for those reasons, and I use them sparingly, but I do use them. So use various apps, so for what that's worth. But Erin, I don't know if you have more to add.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. It's really about, evaluating your comfort level. As an industry, I think folks are moving towards the API data sharing model. So I think that's something that's a little bit more secure than the screen scraping way of collecting data. So that is a consideration that folks should keep in mind as they think about, which apps should they be using, and how necessary are they in your life, and kind of weighing that calculus when deciding whether or not to use a financial app.
Excellent, thank you. And then going right to, I think, with the heart of one of the issues today, is it possible that if our bank account gets hacked, we could be denied the normal protections a consumer would have because we shared our password and username? For example, or in other words, one of the conditions the attendee points out, one of the conditions for consumer protections to apply, as they understand it, is that the account owner does not share their password. So if they did share their password and username, are they now losing protections? Well,
Gotcha. Yeah. So, I mean, at the end of the day, financial institutions, are governed by regulatory bodies and have certain obligations to fulfill. So, a data breach at a FinTech application, does not mean that we do not have those regulatory obligations in place. So, no, I don't believe a customer would lose some of their accesses or protections if they were to face a data breach.
Okay, great. Someone's asking, if you log on directly to the financial institution, to the bank, will you know if there is an app involved? Also, check ordering is easy right from your account, but does it take you to a new vendor? Is this another app? I guess, yeah, understanding what app or what you're connecting to, I guess, is what this is about.
So I think that experience would probably depend on the financial institution, if you're taken to a different page within your online banking experience. But I think, generally, if it has the same URL as your financial institution, likely you're still within your online banking app.
Yeah, I feel like most of the time, when you're signing up, like the consumer is taking active steps to sign up for an app. I think the check ordering checks is but Erin just answered as far as like things you're doing through your bank, whether that's ordering checks or other things, services that are linked to your actual financial institution. But otherwise, I think it's most of the time there's usually not a random app that's connected to your financial institution account online unless you specifically add it, whether it's you signed up for Mint or you signed up for Robinhood or Venmo or what have you. But usually, in most situations, you should know.
Great, thank you. And then an Apple user is telling us that the apps that they use ask permission whether they can collect data across different apps, and they always say no to that. Is that good protection?
Yeah, so I think that represents a trend in making consumers a little bit more aware of how their data is being tracked. So, instead of, let's say, Facebook being able to kind of follow you through your phone experience, kind of the information that you provide stays within the Facebook experience if you ask the app not to track. So this is just a way that I think consumer protection and making customers aware of how their data is being shared is coming to the forefront. So I would say if you do not want data, or if you do not want Facebook, for example, to track your movements around your phone, then I think checking no to that is fine.
Great, thank you. Somebody's asking, what is the rule, if there's a rule, on deleting information after a certain amount of time? How long is that certain time? 10 years? How long can they keep data?
Yeah, so I think that depends on the financial institution, and that will depend on the aggregator or FinTech themselves. So for some, it may be 7 years or longer. For screen scraping, there is no end date for when they can collect that information. I believe that was part of Ben's presentation, but for screen scraping, they can hold on to that information indefinitely. And then it really depends on the relationship between the financial institution and the aggregator for how long they can retain that information from an API perspective.
Yeah, so the question was, is there a rule? And I think Erin's really hitting the nail on the head as far as there really isn't a rule. And so it really goes down to company policy, and usually that's, the data aggregator's policy. I know, just giving one example, I know Consumer Reports, for example, looked into Credit Karma, and and this was, I think, I don't know. I will confess I haven't checked their policy recently, so I don't know if it's changed. But as of a year or two ago, it was that they keep data for 2 years and then they anonymize it, but they don't say when they delete it. And that's just one example. Again, I don't know if their policy has changed, so I feel this is me relying on comments that were submitted earlier this year with my colleagues, but just like, I think that's just one example of like, you'd have to look at the company policy. There isn't a rule that governs that, or really even in FinTech industry practice, I would say. Like, I think there's some things that there's, practices, I think, whether it's 5 years or 7 years or 2 years, but in this evolving space, I think it's really down to the company at this point. No, I mean, I might personally think that there should be a rule, but I don't know of one that in practice or in reality or in rule that actually applies right now.
Great, thank you. And this was something I wanted to ask from, it was in Ben's slides, and Linda talked about shock and awe. Only 16% of app users were aware that apps were selling their data for marketing, research, or other purposes, or that apps were retaining access to information indefinitely, even after you delete the app, or that apps regularly access your data even when you close or delete the app. Even the apps have power of attorney to initiate transactions or other changes to your bank account. Are those kinds of things still, maybe you have a feel for that, Linda? Is that still going on? Is there a little bit of a change or just more transparency about that? That people were not aware, and yet when they were made aware, the majority were concerned about it, uncomfortable with that.
I mean, I think it is true that there is much more awareness lately. I think that it's gotten a lot more attention, and rightfully so. And so there is I mean, Erin was saying, like, there's, whether it's asking, the app store saying, are you okay or not okay with your phone information being shared, or your location, or that sort of thing. And I think all of us, right, most of us who do use smartphones, like, there's been a lot more things that pop up of like, do you give this app permission to, certain data all the time or while you're using it, or never, that sort of thing. And so I think there is a movement because of the greater awareness, that the companies themselves are putting policies in place, and government leaders are looking at this much more closely. So I think that's sort of the trend I've seen in the market. But Erin, I don't know if you have other thoughts.
Yeah, I'll also add in a lot of financial institutions, aggregators, and fintechs are part of a group called Financial Data Exchange, where a lot of the topics revolve around how do we share information for each of the use cases, what is the best practice for making customers aware of the data that they're sharing, or how do we make them aware of the aggregators that are in the middle? How do we, make them aware of some of the terms and conditions? So, as we move away from screen scraping towards this API data sharing model, those are some of the things that this group is really considering from a consumer education and information perspective.
Excellent, thank you. And then I just wanted to ask one last question. This will be the last question unless something else comes in. Erin, you showed us some wonderful slides of what PNC has done to make things a little bit safer. What can folks who say bank with a credit do their financial transaction, if their financial institution is a credit union or a smaller bank, are they going to be able to see those kinds of things, or will they have to partner with someone? What does anyone have a feel for what to expect from your smaller bank at some point, or are they already doing a lot around this?
Yeah, so that is, a question that I think the industry is considering, and I can't speak for any one credit union, but I know we're starting to think about ways that there can be almost like a central network where, there could be one integration point for a financial institution that would enable an easier connection to some of these aggregators and fintechs in the future. So that is something that's happening right now, particularly with Akoya, that will allow banks to connect to these aggregators as almost like a single point of integration. So I think from an industry perspective, we'll see more adoption of that. And it'll speed up the time it takes to get from screen scraping to an API data sharing model. It'll standardize some of those processes as well. So I think we can probably expect to see some of that in the future.
Great, thank you. And there will be a little bit more information about Akoya that Erin just mentioned in the slide deck that you'll get tomorrow. That's it for questions. I'm going to turn it back over to Linda. Thank you so much, Linda and Erin, for your responses.
Thank you, Nelson. Audience, thank you for those great questions. And Linda and Erin, thank you for hanging in there with us and answering all of the questions. Thank you for your patience. Again, this webinar was being presented as part of Consumer Action Share Financial Data with Care project with funding by the Clearinghouse. And if you enjoyed the training, if you enjoyed some of the great information you received today, you can send us a little donation. You can mail a check to us at Consumer Action, 57 Post Street, Suite 611, San Francisco, California. Or you can go online and make a donation. So we'll look forward to getting those checks from you. This concludes our presentation. Again, a special thanks to Ben, Linda, and Erin. Thanks again for joining us today. Our goal was twofold today. It was to shock you into understanding how some apps use your financial information and why it's important that all consumers learn how to share their data with care, and to provide you with tools that you can use to teach your clients, your coworkers, your family members, your church family how to become security savvy. If you found the information, the information presented today useful, put that in the comment section of your evaluation. If you'd like to see more trainings on this topic presented today, put that in the comment section of the evaluation. We truly value your opinion. Again, thank you for joining us today and for the valuable work that all of you do out there. I do look forward to welcome you back really soon. Have a good rest of your day. Goodbye.